Well, good evening, and welcome to this month's edition of NAFI Mentor Live. I'm your host this evening, Paul Prydecker, and I'm proud to be a NAFI board member, and we'd like to welcome you to this edition of our program. NAFI Mentor Live is a live streaming broadcast that occurs the third Wednesday of every month at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. These programs feature a variety of subject matter experts that represent many different aspects of aviation and of particular interest to the flight instructor community. The goal of NAFI Mentor Live is to bring information to pilots and CFIs to help improve safety and to help CFIs do their business and to increase their efficiency and their professionalism and their excellence. And we're also proud to say that NAFI Mentor Live is open to all CFIs and pilots as a NAFI community service. This program for tonight is of interest to many people. It's insurance claims and what they can teach us from some of the lessons that will come from it. The program is going to be presented by Mike Adams. Mike is the Avemco Senior Vice President of Underwriting. And during this presentation, Mike will cover 6 common causes of property loss, in addition to discussing some of the personality traits of pilots that may lead to or perhaps prevent an accident or an event. The information on personality traits has come from research conducted by Dr. Bill Rhodes and funded in part by Avemco. And the end result of the study and this presentation is to simply help identify those areas of training and traits that may contribute to having an accident and to learning from those lessons. Before we get started, however, I'd like to just go over a few useful items. We broadcast this program in a variety of formats to accommodate a wide variety of internet speeds and uses. If you go to the control panel and simply click on HD control, you can set the resolution that you need, or you can just simply select it to auto and it will adjust to this environment. And of particular interest is if you have an internet speed which is rather fast, you may wish to watch this on a large screen TV at your flight school, at your home, or anywhere you have a group of aviators watching this program. So we do our best to accommodate the requirements of all of our viewers. Also on this slide, you can see that we have access to a variety of the archive presentations so that you can go back and review them at your leisure. Of course, one of the benefits of NAFI Mentor Live and programs like this is that we're able to offer wings credit. If you just follow the link where it says earn wing credit and click on that, it will take you to the FAA safety site where you can review the content and take the quiz and then receive wings credit, which is an important part of your own proficiency and training. We really value your feedback. So there's another link for course evaluation. And following this program, we'd encourage you to click the link for course evaluation, share your comments with us, and we'd be more than happy to take them in and use them as we develop future courses. Also, this program from NAFI is offered to aviators from across the industry. And we have a link there for the National Educational Foundation. We would really, really appreciate contributing to this program to help support future broadcasts and to support the NAFI efforts. Lastly, we want you to know that if you go to the chat portion on the Mentor Live page, you can see an area there where you can post your questions. We will try to get to them as often as we can and answer as many as we can, time permitting. But again, this is a way that we can allow you some interaction, and we have an expert in the field who would be happy to address your questions. Tonight's presenter is Mike Adams with Avemco, and as I said, he is the Senior Vice President of Underwriting. Mike's been a pilot since 1983. He started his private pilot training in the Hillsboro, Oregon area. He's also instrument rated, which he feels is an essential rating to have to your certificate. He's one of the individuals who's been able to combine his enjoyment of flying with also a career and make those two work together. Previously, he was the Pacific Northwest Regional Sales Manager, handling a variety of insurance activities from full-service FBOs, CFIs, and non-commercial products for aviation aircraft owners and renters. He's been the president of the Beaverton chapter of the Oregon Pilots Association, and also the president of the State Oregon Pilots Association. Currently, Mike leads Avemco's underwriting operations at his home in Frederick, Maryland. So without any further ado, let's bring Mike on and welcome you to the program, Mike.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's a very nice introduction. It sounds like that might have been written by my wife, but I'm not too
sure.
There
you go. So as I said, Mike, you're one of the individuals who can combine, a love of aviation with also a career, and it's you must enjoy blending both of those activities.
Yeah, it is real interesting. You do get to see a little bit of the negative side of everything in insurance, but the positive is that we've had the information that we can start to share with customers and potential clients to hopefully keep them out of trouble as they continue on in their flying career or avocation, whichever they prefer on that.
Well, you mentioned sharing. I have a presentation that I've done for a variety of audiences, and the title of the presentation is Never Waste a Mistake. And the spirit of that is we're all going to make mistakes. Everybody has made some kind of a mistake in their aviation career. And the key part is to, acknowledge it, learn from it, share the information, and turn it into a learning experience. So I think that's going to be the spirit of most of your presentation this evening about accidents, events, incidents, mistakes, and how we can all learn from them.
Absolutely. That's the intent, that we all go away with something that we can do ourselves or also share with any of our students or clients that we instruct.
Well, let's get going, Mike.
Okay, that sounds real good. So as the title says, insurance claims, what they can teach us. And I always like to start with this particular slide here. And sometimes I'll run a test on it, but I'll just quickly point out that bear is exhibiting extremely poor form if he's trying to hand prop that airplane. As you know, there should be either a pilot or a trained mechanic at the controls, because as you'll see a little later in the presentation, we see quite a few claims that come in involving hand propping or taxiing that really ought not to happen. Now, if the bear is checking the propeller for nicks and rocks and dings after making a landing on an unimproved airfield, well, kudos to the bear and carry on. So let's move on to the next slide now that we know that the bear is safe. And real quick, I want to point out, this is Avemco information that I'm sharing. So if you're looking at some of the numbers that come up later in the program and you say, well, that doesn't match what I see in the NAL report or the NTSB, that is correct. This is our information and it does not match the NTSB or the NAL report. I jokingly say if there's the potential of someone else paying for a loss, then it always gets reported. If you might be have a suspension or have to take a check ride, that may not get reported in that case. But real quick, Avemco is a direct writer of insurance. We've been around since 1961. I am a private pilot, instrument rated. Just a little interesting thing about Avemco, and then we'll move on to the next slide, is that we issued our first policy in 1961, along about January, and we had our first claim about 3 months later in April of 1961. The individual that bought the first policy was an early adopter because he also had the very first claim that we had. Subsequently, that plane has been repaired and it is still on the FAA record book. So we've been around for a while. We know how to take care of people. So a little bit moving on with the next one here. What we came up with and how we formed this program and why we as an Avemco, an insurance company, decided to go out and talk to people about what we saw in claims is that we do have claim review meetings where we sit down and look at the claims that we get consistently. We do an underwriting analysis of it, partially to see is our policy text and wording taking care of customers as they expect to be taken care of? Are we collecting a premium so we can pay the claims without any problems and things like that? And a couple other things came out of those meetings. That mind-numbing consistency is we came to the conclusion that we as pilots weren't very original in how we had accidents or what we were doing that were contributing to accidents. So that got us wondering, is it a skill level or are there some other traits? We were able to connect with Dr. Bill Rhodes, the U.S. Air Force, retired, along about 2006. So this Airman's Education Research Initiative isn't brand new, and we've been kind of talking about it all along here. But Bill's interest was, what are the traits or what do we as human beings do that would contribute to a loss? And as an insurance company, if we can decrease losses, we're keenly interested in that. As several people have said, a lot of the traits that make a good pilot are also the same traits that get us into trouble. So now that we've got the background set, I usually do a little survey. So if we take a look at this next slide here, and if I were talking to a live audience that I could actually see, I generally ask someone to say, or I ask the question of everyone here in the accident, how many of you know a fellow aviator or personally know an aviator that has been injured or deceased in an aviation accident? You can mentally raise your hand and say, yeah, I do, or you can leave it down. And then the question I ask is, how many people were surprised by that? And about half the hands go down. So you have an idea of how commonplace this is. In any given audience, when I run this survey, about 40% of the people raise their hand to that first question. Yeah, they know someone in aviation that has been injured or hurt. When we get to the surprise part, about 50% of that 40%, or again, half of them, keep their hand up. They were not surprised about what had happened to that pilot. And so we have to ask our question, and this is the willing or not, and I'll pose it directly to the flight instructors, is, do you teach and have you taught and have you thought about, when I'm finished with this student or this client, I'm willing to climb into the back seat of their airplane, blindfolded, handcuffed, and strapped in? And if the answer is no, then you say, would you do that to a loved one? And again, if the answer is no, then maybe we ought to take a look about, we've taught skills, but we haven't addressed part of the issue of that personality trait that may lead to an accident there.
So Mike, when you do this, and I'm sure in some audience setting, and you get this kind of input, when people say they're not surprised, is that directly related to these personality traits that are very visible, that kind of show maybe a bit of a red flag?
Yes, when you get right down to it, Paul, they do. It's a bit of, and the next slide does it, perfect lead in, thank you on this. The next slide here does bring up some of the things that came out of it, is that we found that, you know, doing is important and that industry overall teaches us what to do. The thing that was surprising is often we as pilots, we know what to do, we just fail to do it. And this information, it came from Dr. Rhodes' studies where he talked to experienced aviators, talked to inexperienced aviators when he could get them to talk to flight instructors, talk to aviation insurance underwriters, and also to claims adjusters. So he started to compile all of this, and it kind of came out to the sort of person one is really matters a lot when you get down to aviation. And the common knowledge is kind of that 50% of the audience that weren't surprised that they knew a pilot that was going to have an accident. It's just there was something that they either felt or just the overall attitude of the individual. Time is of an essence. The money costs too much. I'm not going to do a warm-up. I don't need a briefing. It's just a local flight. I don't want to wait for the fuel truck. I've got enough gas. All of a sudden, you know, even though you didn't when you called the fuel truck to come out, that's a whole nother presentation from last year. What kind of pilot runs out of fuel?
Well, you make a very good point too, because as instructors, the instructor's job is to make sure that we're teaching how to do things correctly. I don't know of any instructor who says to a student or to a client, no, you don't need to worry about doing a pre-flight. It's your own airplane. Don't worry about it. Nobody would say that. So everybody has the skill set and they've had the right training. It's what is it about pilots that will cause us to maybe make an incorrect decision? And I'm sure that's what some of the research addressed.
Correct. And the other thing, and that kind of, again, leads into that third bullet point, the but, little or no theory of airmanship. You brought up, an instructor doesn't tell a pilot to skip a pre-flight because it's his own airplane or her own airplane, et cetera. But those insidious little patterns that people develop do start to creep in. And if they're not addressed, then they become an accepted behavior. And as an instructor, if you start to see someone that does get a little bit short on the pre-flight, or they don't do a weight and balance calculation, or they don't stop and think about that takeoff they're about to do, and well, I've done it before, then we're starting to see a little bit of that personality trait where complacency breeds contempt almost. And we see that quite a bit.
And when you're doing a check ride as an examiner, you are good at looking at things like airspeed, altitude, course, those sorts of things. Nowhere on your check ride can you evaluate personality traits, except perhaps judgment, but certainly not things like complacency and your attitude about time management and things like that.
Right. And you know that the candidate's always going to be on their best behavior.
Of course.
It's the big date night. You're cleaned up, you took a bath, you're going to behave on it.
That's right.
And that kind of led into the thing about little or no theory of airmanship. And we don't have any common language. And kind of the question that I'll leave with everyone on this before we go on to the next slide is airmanship the superior pilot skills because of a less than a superior decision was made? Or is airmanship a superior decision and you get by with less than superior skills? Or is it striving to have superior skills that you don't need to use because you've made superior decisions in your flying? So that's kind of something to think about as we go along. So let's take a look at some of these things that we've noticed people and personality traits contribute to losses that really we ought not to have. And so John, if we can have the next slide pop up. And this is always a fun one to do. And I don't have any way to check people, but I'm going to say, all right, as you're sitting there at home or in your chair, if you had a piece of paper, general aviation, what do you think a tow bar costs? And I'll admit that the tow bar on the screen is much nicer than what I ever got with the rental aircraft that I used and things. So, I'd hear anywhere from $100, $75, $300 and things. And so if we move to the next slide, I'll show you how much a tow bar can really cost. Yeah, about $10,000. And that's because it was left on the airplane when the engine was started. And on this slide, if you can see it, on the left photo, you can see a little red arrow pointing to the prop where there's a little bit of damage. And on the right photo, you can see another arrow pointing to a scuff on the cowl. The scuff on the cowl is somewhat inconsequential, but it still needs to be repaired. That little nick on the prop is very consequential because the propeller manufacturer and the engine manufacturer say, hey, if the prop needs service or it's dinged like that, you have to do a tear down and an inspection to make sure that there's no damage to the engine. So all of a sudden, it's not just file out a blade, but it's an engine tear down and inspection. You've got a plane out of service. So it only takes a minute or two to stop and think, where is that tow bar? Is it in my hand? Have I secured it in the hangar, if that's where I'm going to put it before I take off? Or is it secured safely in the baggage compartment of the airplane? Don't make an assumption on there. And what we found with most losses on tow bars is the pilot says, well, I got interrupted in a pre-flight, and They just didn't back up on it. So in going with things that pilots ought to do or maybe rush and get into trouble, I'd like to bring up the next slide. And I'll give you a little bit of story on that. And you can, again, with the same piece of paper where you wrote down $50 for the tow bar, you can jot down what you think caused that dent that is exhibited by the red arrow on the front strut, and this is a Piper PA-18. Don't get distracted by the wood on the rear strut. This is a plane up in Alaska, and quite often that's how they secure the aircraft against some of the winds and things. But we've got a dent in the front strut. Incidentally, there's a dent directly above that dent in the strut in the leading edge of the wing. So the question is that I asked, what's anyone think that caused that dent? And everyone goes, well, it's Alaska. It could be a moose. They maybe taxied into a lamppost. Maybe it was a fuel truck on there. Maybe someone taxied too close to it. And those are all good guesses. But the truth is, that's a tow bar accident. And what it was, pilot pulled his plane out of a hangar, got distracted in the pre-flight, started the engine, and this time, instead of the prop just hitting the tow bar and that being the end of it, kind of like Arnold Palmer, it was a perfect chip shot. The tow bar flew across the ramp and damaged that other Super Cub there. Incidentally, if you ever do that, it's going to make a lot of noise. Anyone on the airfield is going to notice that. So you won't be able to sneak away without leaving a note on the damaged airplane that, hey, you know, I did this, give me a call.
I suppose it would sound something like a fork in the garbage disposal, huh?
Quite a bit louder, actually. Not that I've personally done that. I want to point that out. But the end result is that through a little bit of inattention or rushing something, we now have 2 airplanes out of service and quite a bit of expense that's going to affect everyone's premiums when it comes to claims and things. And so if we move on to some facts here, everyone loves facts in aviation. I just want to bring out a couple numbers, and you'll see more numbers as we go along. This dubious beginnings of flights. Again, this is Avemco data. Out of 100 claims, every year I know that 3 of them are going to be a hangar rash. And that's where someone either forgot to lift the door enough, wide enough, didn't have marks on it or such. The thing that surprises a lot of people, though, is that 11% are taxi claims. And that kind of surprised us, too, when we got looking at it.
What's an example of a taxi claim, Mike?
Well, the taxi claim, the classic is that someone's going through a tight area, and rather than shutting down the engine and getting out and checking it, or not remembering that if the shadows are going to touch, there's a high likelihood the objects are going to touch, and they hit a spinner, another wingtip. We've had people taxi into fuel islands, actually getting a little too close with it. A lot of it is distracted taxiing. Now, I'll use a Rod Machado joke here that there's nothing that strikes more fear into a runner pilot than a runaway Hobbs meter. And so once they've started the airplane, they're going to jot down their clearance. They're going to tell the tower they've already got the ground clearance. They're going to be playing with the radios as they taxi out to the runway. And I learned to fly in Hillsboro. It's got a rather long runway. And at 4 miles an hour, it seems like the taxi to the far end of the predominant runway took forever. And so you start to taxi a little bit faster, and then pretty soon you're doing something, you forgot your aileron controls, your elevator controls, the gust of wind comes along, and for some reason, you just veer off the side of the taxiway, totally unbeknownst to you. At least that's what's reported on the claim. So those are the kind of taxi claims we see. As an instructor, please don't do anything that's going to get both your and your client's head down inside the cockpit. So if someone says, well, gee, look at what that's doing over there, or I'll set this up for you, make sure that the other person is looking outside. We do see, some admissions of, well, I was doing the multitask with the taxi loss.
Well, that's especially important too with the prevalence of all the automation that we're able to put into our aircraft now. It really can be a distractor when you have so many inputs that you can make. And if you're single pilot especially, you're going to be driven to be inside more than you should be.
And absolutely. And I wasn't going to throw any stones at technically advanced aircraft, but we have seen a bit of an uptick in our taxi losses with some of the more complex avionics that are attractive to look at or are attention drawers out there. So please, if you're going to have the engine running or you're taxiing, look around outside. If you're playing with the avionics and things, make sure you're stopped and make sure you've got the brakes securely set, which will kind of lead us into some of these next pictures here. Everyone learns differently. We have the audio, one I'm not going to sing in this presentation, and we also have the visual where you can see what happens. So hopefully this is the only time you'll see what happens to a hangar when someone hand props a Cessna 182 that has a drained battery. And one of the hand prop techniques is like when you're starting a lawnmower, if it doesn't start first, you advance the throttle a little more. And finally, about the 10th time the guy flipped the prop, that plane was ready to go. He got out of the way, no injuries to the person, but it did go across the taxiway and run into the other hangar on the other side.
That doesn't look like it's going to buff out.
No, that's not going to buff out. And we've got that engine tear down prop and things. So that's some damage there from the outside. If we take a look at this next slide, which is rather impressive, this is what happens when a 182 taxis straight head on into a hangar door. And this was one where the individual had started the airplane. It was warming up. They were inside the airplane. They slid their seat back so they could get something out of the back seat of the airplane, didn't notice that the plane started to creep forward. And by the time they realized what was happening, they were far enough back that they couldn't get to the controls. The good news is that once the plane got a little ways just short of hitting the airplane that's inside the hangar, the wings blocked it from going any further on that hangar door. But again, that's a situation where the pilot kind of trusted the parking brakes when they really shouldn't on that. Okay.
And as often the case, even in these events, it's not one thing that's contributing. There are several things that are contributing to this.
Yes, and some of it could be situational awareness on it. You start a 182 and it's cold, it's going to run it a certain way. As it warms up, the engine's going to run a little smoother on there. It's going to develop a little more power on it. As the brakes start to warm or something, they may contract a little bit. And so you got to pay attention to all the parameters out there. Not sure why the pilot decided they had to get something out of the back seat at that particular time versus before they started, but that's what happened. There's the end result. So if we take a look at a few more things having to do with ground losses and stuff, and I'm going to ask instructors here, and you can do that electronic show of hands if you want. How many of you, when you're dealing with a client, and the client has an airplane that they store in a hangar, do you go with them and watch or help them get the plane out of the hangar? You go back and help put it back in the hangar. You notice how they do it. Because what we found with hangar claims is that owners oftentimes think they know where everything goes. And so that photo on the left is where someone was putting their airplane back into their T hangar, and they didn't have any ground marks on the hangar floor. They didn't have any stop blocks. They just always knew that they pushed it about so far. Now you can kind of tell from the damage where the red arrow is, that was quite a push. So I think in the picture, the person had a storage locker or something there that kind of stuck out a little bit. But by the same token, having some visual markers on the floor stop blocks would have prevented that. The center picture, again, that's another not knowing where the boundaries of your hangar are. That's an elevator that got a little bit of a push on it. The photo on the right is interesting. For anyone that's wondering about it, that is the fuselage of a Cessna 206. And so I normally ask people, okay, if you're working with clients with hangars or you keep your plane in a hangar, when you open the hangar door, do you know where those doors go? Have you gone out and looked at it beforehand? Have you opened the door and said, yep, they go exactly where I go? And I ask that because that picture on the right is the result of someone with a 206 opening up their hangar door, pulling the plane halfway out. For some reason, they stopped halfway out. Maybe they got a phone call, had to get a cup of coffee or something. Our customer, who was in the adjacent hangar, had a 182, unlocked the door and put their shoulder into the door, and these are bypass type doors, and got pushing it, not thinking at all about where that hangar door was going. Well, we know it went right into the side of that Cessna 206. So If you do have customers with hangars, take a look at it, see if they're doing anything from habits or things that they've just developed that might be contributing to a claim. And that brings up a question of the people that have the vertical lift doors and things. Do you always lift to the full opening of the hangar, which in some cases, depending upon the airplane, is a lot of extra wasted lift. If you don't lift full time, please put marks on the sides of the beams along the door, because we've had a number of claims that come in where the customer said, well, I always lift it 2/3 and the 182 fits out just fine until the time it didn't. Then we have an anti-collision light or a nav light up there that has to be repaired in another plane out of service. So those are kind of simple things that you think of. If you stop and think about it, don't get complacent. Every time you open a hangar, it's different. Every time you put a plane back in a hangar, it's a little bit different.
And you know, Mike, what you're discussing here when you say know your boundaries, it's another way of really saying you have to have really good situational awareness. I mean, we talk about situational awareness in flight all the time, but of course it starts with the pre-flight and post-flight and just how you're managing these types of events.
Yep, absolutely, it does. All right, so unfortunately, Draco hit the YouTube circles this week as a classic lead into this next slide. So let's take a look, and I'm slowly working up to more and more frequency of claims that we see that could be used or hopefully taken care of with training. And that's the takeoff claims. You know, everyone thinks, well, the takeoff's fairly easy. You line up down the runway, you develop power. But what we found with the takeoff claims here is that pilots don't sit down and think about what's different about this situation. Is the density altitude different? Is there dew on the grass today that there usually isn't? Is the passenger that I've invited to fly with me larger than who I usually fly with? Have I got more fuel, more luggage? Have I been lucky before? How are the winds? What's the location of the sun? And are there any cats involved? I threw in the cats as a little bit of a story. As more pilots become involved with relocating rescue dogs and flying with pets and things, you as an instructor hopefully will work with your clients to say, you know, the first time you put in an airplane, you really ought to put them in a pet carrier or have them on a leash and with someone else holding them, because your pet may be the perfect deer in the auto out to the airport, but as soon as they get into an airplane and that engine starts to, that plane starts to accelerate, that may be a totally different animal. And we did have one claim where a fellow decided to take his cat flying. Cat was perfectly fine in the car, traveled with him in the car all the time. Classic cat maneuver, started his takeoff run. Cat went wild inside the cab, distracted the guy, clawed him a little bit, and the person ended up running off the side of the runway during the takeoff run. So, you know, think about all the different parameters, as you said, Paul, situational awareness.
Mike,
So
before you move on, we do have a question from one of our viewers. It's an interesting one, and that is, from where you sit and in your perspective, would you recommend a lesson or somebody teaching people just these topics in terms of hangar rash avoidance, how to put your airplane away? It's not something that as an instructor I really spent much time doing, but I think that's not a bad idea. Would you think that's something that we should think about?
I think that's an excellent idea, and kind of why I brought it up. And thank you, Bob, for asking that question. You know, if you want to look at yourself as being the ultimate professional instructor, you know, the flight begins actually before the person gets to the airport. Sure. But everything about that thing with the airplane, maybe even getting down to the free coffee and the FBO before you take off, is something that you should work with on your clients, because we make a lot of assumptions, and a lot of people learn by experience, and we all know that experience has a high tuition involved associated with it. So yes, if you can offer your services. Now, I'll admit that the client may say, I think you're trying to pad your bill, and you know, I don't want you to do this. That's a different topic. I'm not a CPA. You can handle that elsewhere, but it would be, I think, a service to help someone, because you as the instructor, you see a lot, you've learned this, and you're going, you know, this is what Avemco has noticed, or this is what we see with losses? You know, how much stuff do they have in the hangar itself type thing?
Well, Mike, I know you have quite a bit more to cover here, so go ahead, move on.
Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, just to help us learn visually, some examples of what happens with a loss of control on takeoff. This one ended up on its nose. You can see in the lower left damage to the passenger side wing root, damage to the passenger side leading edge of the wing. This actually was enough to total out this airplane. So takeoff losses do cause some incidents. And in takeoff losses, a lot of people are concerned about animal strikes, also with landing losses. So I brought up a slide, which is the next one here, that does talk about animals. And yes, they do impact takeoff and landings. But overall, now not to discount it, it's less than 1% of the claims we get out of every year on it. This one here that we're looking at is a Piper Archer. It was a takeoff with a student pilot and a CFI at night. They were getting the student ready for his night flight train, and a deer came out and hit it. The good news is, or actually they hit the deer when the deer ran out on the runway. The good news is that they safely stopped on the runway. The young man that was the student pilot has since passed his private check ride. And as an insurance person, I'm really pleased to see those blue stains along that wing, which tells me they had quite a bit of fuel left in the airplane on their takeoff. And again, that ties into that presentation a year ago, what kind of pilot runs out of fuel, which surprises you how much they do that. The next slide here is another animal strike that we often fear, and this is a goose and a Grumman AA5. Again, VFR. The thing that was kind of interesting on this one, or actually a couple things that come out, is planes are extremely flyable after a bird strike. So the first thing is fly, land immediately. Don't panic on it. The backstory on that Grumman was the pilot was flying day VFR. They saw a flight of two birds, weren't sure if they were in formation, but the pilot took evasive action, managed to miss one bird and hit the other bird. So the assumption is the second bird also took evasive action, kind of like that squirrel ad on the Geico insurance out there. But again, they said they're very noisy when they hit, but it's something that you can easily survive and land. The next slide here.
This is, I think, everybody's worst fear, isn't it?
Yes. This one here is the bird strike we all fear through the windshield. And then Tim, I see your question. I'll get to that in just a second. This is where the bird came through the windscreen. Fortunately, the bird didn't hit the pilot. And a little note, if you're talking about personality traits or things to think about, is you might start to consider wearing safety glasses if you don't have to wear spectacles all the time anyway, or if you're not wearing sunglasses. Because in this situation, the pilot said he was wearing sunglasses and was extremely glad that he was, because when you go from virtually no wind on your face to about 100-mile-an-hour wind on your bare eyes, you're going to tear up right away and make visibility a little more difficult. We had the same comment when a goose or a duck went through a windshield of a Cessna 150 out in Coeur d'Alene. The thing that both pilots said, which is interesting, is that it took a lot of throttle and a lot of power to keep the flying speed up, because they've suddenly gone from a windscreen to basically pushing an air dam through the air. Now both pilots were able to land, both planes were repaired, and they kept on flying here. A question that came up is, were the cases I presented covered completely by Avemco, or were they considered negligent behavior? I'm going to answer that question by negligent behavior is not an exclusion written into the policy. So if all of the other terms and conditions of the policy have been met, then yes, they were paid. The other thing is that, no, I'm not going to present a claim where we denied coverage and made a customer mad. We have a very low claim denial rate, and most of the time it's because the pilot either didn't have the experience they presented to us when we sold them the policy, which is a material misrepresentation, or something like that. But all of these claims, all conditions were met, and negligence is not excluded from the policy. Okay, so in negligence, let's move on to the next slide, because we're going to jump back to some traits in ARI. What Dr. Rhodes found out or came to is, the sort of person one is with a pilot seems to matter a lot whether they're going to have a claim or have a potential of a claim. Having a commitment to doing it right was very critical to those that had claims versus not had claims when he looked at it. And impressing others was not a factor. The photos on this slide are pretty tragic. This is a Beech B-55. It involved 4 fatal, and it was returning from an air show where the pilot, relatively young in their flying career, had taken 3 friends with him to the show. And there was, I think it was Bobby Yunkin at the time, with the Traveler was doing the aerobatics. And so this pilot decided to show his friends that he too could do a role in a Baron. Unsuccessful, unfortunately, on it. One of the tragedies that came out of this is that during the investigation, both by the insurance company, the NTSB, and the FAA, is that people at the airport knew that this young man was trying to roll his twin. And someone had said, sure, no problem as long as you keep positive G's on everything, like the 707 over Lake Washington at Seafair when that first came out. So there's someone that maybe should have said something, but they didn't, or they conveyed the wrong message. And here's a young man that was trying to impress others. So pilots that don't have losses generally are not in the business of impressing other people. They're there for the safety. I do want to get a quick note here. Insurance adjusters, NTSB, FAA, they all work independently. We do not share information with the NTSB. We handle claims per the contract of the policy. Actually, NTSB information isn't even able to be used if we're defending our client if there's a suit or a claim for bodily injury or property damage. So you can work independently with all 3 organizations. The insurance company is on your side to protect you. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about people. Just checking my notes, not impress others, right. Okay, and a little bit later, we'll get back to impressing others and how things affect that. But let's take a look at where we humans come back and have some claims that hopefully through good instruction we can take care of. And that's going to be pointed out on the next slide, which shouldn't surprise too many people here that landings seem to have a pretty high number. And I want to make a mention of that equipment related, that the 6% gear malfunction on landing. If you're a fixed gear pilot, don't breathe easy. We do have quite a few fixed landing gear failures or malfunctions on landings. And we don't count a landing 10 feet off the deck and then dropping the plane in and splaying the landing gear out is a malfunction of the landing gear. What we generally see is if you're into backcountry flying or carrying a lot of heavy loads, you've got a 206, Cherokee 6, something like that, pay attention to the landing gear because over time it will start to show some wear and tear. And at some point, one of the mains may just fold up because of a sheared pin or a crack that hasn't been discovered in the normal annual. So if you've got a high time airplane, you've had some less than gentle landings, you might want to have your mechanic, or if you're the A&P, take a closer look at your landing gear at the annuals. That 2% gear up landing, that's where the pilot just fessed up that, yep, I forgot, I got distracted in my checklist, something came up with me. It is amazing how many times in the forensics study of that, once the plane has been lifted back up, we run the gear test to see what happened, and everything works perfectly fine. So this is where I usually talk about, do a survey and say, do you all know what you do if you see a gear up landing and you're the first responder to get out to the airplane? And I see some puzzled looks, and occasionally someone will say, yeah, you reach in and you put the landing gear lever in the down position. So that's the joke of this evening here. Actually, you ask if they're okay, and then you make sure that if you do put the landing gear down, you clean your fingerprints off of it so that they can't go retroactive on it. The bigger aspect here is the pilot related. That 28 out of 100 claims every year are related to what we as pilots do or don't do. And so that's do we know the crosswind? Have we got an alternate airport? Have we made a decision that if we get to somewhere and it's not exactly as we see it, we have an alternate and we're prepared and ready to go to that alternate? Again, it's not impressing others. It's not, I can save this type thing. It's that let's go and do the right thing to be safe. Are we unrealistic in our abilities, or the airplane? Or are we just rusty on developing or calculating our crosswind components? So as instructors out there, I will ask this question. How many of you, if you have some clients or regular clients that you work with, when you get a day with some nice crosswinds out there, you start calling your customers and asking if do they want to go out and get some current crosswind landings in place? I had the good fortune of being in an airport that had a nice crosswind landing, so that the instructor was always happy to go up in horrid crosswinds because he knew that we had to bail out to land on it. But that crosswind landing made a big difference with a lot of things. Okay, so if we take a look at this next slide, what has to do with retractable gear aircraft. Now, you all probably thought, well, in talking about retracts, we jumped to the conclusion, well, we're going to see a picture of a Bonanza, a Mooney, a Cutlass, an Arrow, or something. Anything that has landing gear that can go up or down or be maneuvered is viable or a candidate for some kind of a mishap. This one happened in Alaska. It's wheel skis out there where the wheels are on their fixed axles, and the skis hydraulically lift up and down depending upon whether you're landing on snow or landing on land. And just like with amphibious floats, you can land with the skis down on a hard surface runway and get by with it. You'll hear a lot of noise and scraping, but when you land on snow with the wheels extended through those skis, you're going to flip over. So run checklists, pay attention. Don't think, well, it's a simple airplane, won't be an issue at all. So I'm going to move on to the next one here, where we get into some pilot skills or lack thereof. This is a claim that the pilot said, yep, I just wasn't current. My technique wasn't right. I hit the brakes a little too hard on landing. All things considered, looking at the airplane, the tires out there, and the gravel out there, that would have been a perfectly adequate landing spot had they been current and used the right technique with braking. So my question here on this one is, and you don't have to answer it, is that which direction was that pilot landing on there? Was he coming towards us or landing away from us? You can figure out your own answer. Let's move on to the next slide here so I can not overdo my time. Getting back to tricycle fixed gear pilots, loss of directional control on landing, ground loops. We used to think that was the domain of tailwheel aircraft. This is a Cessna 182 to prove that that is not true. This is a ground loop in a 182 due to crosswind and lack of rudder inputs on there. Results in pretty much the same thing as you get on a tailwheel. Prop strike, damage to the wing, a little bit of damage to the landing gear there.
Mike, I have the opportunity to preview your next slide on causes of claims summary, and probably the most important piece of data on that slide is the last piece of data.
Yes, that's why it's bold-faced. Thank you. And this is a chance to jot down some notes if you want some backup to why you want to work with your clients on certain things or not, and kind of where the claims are coming from most frequent to less frequent. So the question generally comes up, well, what about the other 46 or 52% of the claims? And those are unusual enough or not person-related. As an example, we have weather-related claims where the pilot's not involved at all. Those are about 18 out of 100 every year. So that takes a pretty good chunk there. But yeah, take a quick look at it. Landings are number one. Pilot action on landings, pilot distraction on taxiing, takeoffs, bad decision-making, bad technique or something, malfunction, mechanical stuff. We can pay you the better annuals. Maybe if the thing passes an annual, but the maintenance says the A&P says you need to keep an eye on it, maybe you ought to just go ahead and get it fixed on there. And then the gear up landings. on it. Okay, so the one thing that I'll go on this, let's go back to human factors here again on it. I apologize, I'm not sure what claim that picture came from, other than it's a twin that was rather badly damaged. But some of the things that Bill Rhodes came up with on it are that we GA pilots, we're not trained to military or airline standards. We strive for that. You might push that with your clients to hold yourself to the same standards. We as general aviation pilots don't really have anyone else to put our emotions in check and say, no, I'm the weather guy, and the weather guy says, you can't fly this because the plane's not competent, or you're not competent, or your instrument currency is expired on there. We are the weather person. We let the emotions get in the way sometimes. Are we, the load master, have we got that figured out? Have we got the cross-country trip figured out? And are we the dispatcher? And in all of those functions, we let our emotions kind of run amok. And here's where I'll fill in a little bit of a story. Bill Rhodes, when he was doing this study, he came up with several simulator situations that he put pilots in to try and figure out which pilots had accidents or got killed in the sim situation, and which pilots survived all three of them, and what was the difference. I died in 2 of the 3. In hindsight, I think I survived the other 2 just out of dumb luck. The one that killed me was that I thought I had let the emotions take over and say, I can help these people, I can do this, I'm a pilot, pilots do this, it's not as bad as it looks. Well, boy, was I surprised when that happened. And a little bit of a note, Loretta Godby, who is with NAFI and is listening in, she was the passenger that died with me in that. I'm going to blame it on the passenger, not the pilot. But no, it was strictly the pilot skills, where Bill put me in a situation that I let the emotions take over of me being a good pilot versus thinking like a professional. And so that moves us into the next slide, where some of the things that come out, if you're going to fly as an airman fly, we need to learn to compartmentalize. And that's the weather person, the weight and balance, the load, and all like that. So we need to compartmentalize, give them all equal credence. Don't let our emotions take over. We need to have a professional detachment and get that installed in our clients, where, yeah, emotionally, I want to make this flight, but professionally, I know that it's not going to work. So we need to think like the pilot and not the passenger. If the journey is in jeopardy, then the destination just isn't worth it. Thinking like a passenger it's always the destination. Okay, so we have a few more things that come up, and then we'll get back into the insurance person's favorite topic, and that's accident numbers. We do need to be responsible. Now, public confession may be good for the soul. It's not always the best for everyone, but we do need to admit our shortcomings. We do need to be forthright with ourselves and with our passengers. If we say, yeah, we're going to make this trip, and then it turns out different, we need to tell them, no, we're not going to do it. We need to be honest about it, and we need to check our ego in place. We're not there to be the savior of everything. And then the last one comes up into that willing to say something. And everyone looks at that and goes, well, gee, how do I tell my buddy that they're thinking that they're acting kind of like a dumb pilot, or they're making a bad decision without offending them? I don't have an answer for that. That's a difficult decision, difficult conversation. But the other thing about willing to say something is, if you see someone that looks like they're going to take a trip and then they scrub it because something isn't right, compliment them on the decision.
I think one way to have that conversation, Mike, is to draw on your own experiences. If you see somebody about to do something, you can simply say, based on my experience, this or that either happened or didn't happen, and maybe you want to rethink that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And feel free to do, basically. Yeah, any of these things that we've got here for that. But positive reinforcement. Yeah, the weather wasn't quite right. You didn't feel quite up to par. Good decision. No one's going to look down on you or think any less of you for making that decision. Sure. So let's move on to the next slide. Yeah, let's hit the. Okay, John, you may have to hit the go button. Let's go again. Okay, again and again. Okay, well, technology, you gotta love it. What those three colored bars are is the red color are pilots that had 0 to 10 hours in make and model. The purple bars are pilots that had 10 to 50 hours in make and model. And the green bar are pilots that had more than 50 hours in make and model. We didn't pay any attention to total time or certificates and ratings. We just looked at make and model time. And we said, okay, where are we seeing the accidents on our takeoff, which is going to be the far left on there. Excuse me, those are takeoff, far left. That second to the left, second from the left is en route. The middle bar graphs are landings. The second from the right, where it has just red and green, those are taxi losses. And then the far to the right are ground losses. And ignore the far to the right ground losses. So when you're working with clients and you've got someone that's transitioning into an airplane, they have less than 10 hours in it, you can see that the likelihood of a takeoff loss is fairly high. If you can't take off, you can't have an en route loss. So that's why their number's low. And there's a high likelihood of a landing loss. As they get a little more experience, their takeoffs, their en routes are pretty good. Possibly they're a little bit overconfident on the landings. So those are up there. If they've got more than 50 hours in the plane, then their takeoffs aren't bad. They're making great en route decisions. They've got alternates, and their landing accidents are a little bit less because they know either how to land or go to that alternate. The taxi one, which is the second from the right, that's pretty surprising. I won't say that we have absolutely no accidents involving taxi with pilots of 50 to 100 hours, or excuse me, 10 to 50 hours in the airplane, but we have so few they're statistically insignificant on there. But we do see quite a few taxi losses where someone is being checked out in the airplane, two heads are down, etc. When we get to the higher time pilot, they may have more experience or more complicated avionics, and therefore they're going to be distracted with their taxiing. And I'll explain the ground loss on this next slide here. It'll make perfect sense to you. Okay, there is the classic example of a high time pilot in make and model with a ground loss. This is a tundra tire up in Alaska. Pilot flew out to the bush, was gone for the day fishing or something, came back and discovered that a bear had either come by and tested out their brand new pedicure or wanted to check the nails that they just got done at the salon. But ultimately, they ended up with a flat tire out there in the bush. So that's a ground loss that the pilot has absolutely no control over. The longer you own an airplane, the more exposure units you have, and therefore the likelihood of a ground loss goes up. Now, the thing that's really interesting, John, if you'll advance to the next slide here, is how the fellow got home. In Alaska, they carry a pretty extensive survival emergency kit, and they had just enough patches, and I don't know if maybe they borrowed some from the other plane that was there, to patch up that tire, and those patches were good for one takeoff and one landing. That got them out of there, got them back to their home base, and that's where the tire was replaced. Incidentally, tires like that run about $2,500, and yes, that would be a covered insurance loss. So I've got one more number here that I like to show you because insurance people like numbers, and that's coming up. One of the things that we did on landing losses is we looked at our landing accidents and tried to determine how long it had been from when the person last flew with an instructor and when they had a landing accident or a landing claim. And it either came from when there was some dual signed off in their logbook or their last flight review on it. And the average time of all of our landing claims, this is over a 10-year study of landing claims, was 373 days. And that is one reason why Avemco promotes annual flight training for their customers. We give a premium credit for it. We support the Wings program. If you do win the Wings pins, we're the company that buys them and sends them out to you on behalf of the FAA. And you can now use this number, 373, with your clients to help convince them that they need to fly with you on an annual basis because it's going to decrease the potential of them having a loss. And with that, we can move to the last slide. Very important phone number. And you want to jot that down. And now we've got, I think, a couple minutes for some question and answers, or have I used up all the time?
Well, we're just a little bit over, Mike, but there's a couple of comments here that we'd like to just bring up and, take advantage of your expertise here. The first comment was from our NAFI board chairman, Bob Mader, who made a comment that it seems like good instruction is the best line of defense against events like this. And I certainly agree with that. I mean, this is, part of our NAFI's, mission is to try to take good instructors and make them better, and to be able to pass that on to our clients and our students. The other question is from Bruce. If you go back to some of your data, do you have a handle on percentage of takeoff accidents that were due to loss of power?
Unfortunately, I don't, but it's got to be insignificant enough that it wasn't something that we would particularly count on. I mean, we all train for it. We hear about it. There was a tragic loss of power, double fatality out in Hood River just last week, 2 weekends ago. But the numbers from an insurance standpoint, and I don't mean to be too cold-hearted, but I'm an insurance person, is that it's not statistically significant. But don't stop training for it. Straight ahead, get the nose down, be prepared, because the loss of power on takeoff generally is fairly tragic on there when you look at it as far as the accidents in that way. But as far as the number, very few.
Well, Mike, this has been wonderful. It's another way of looking at safety. It's another way of looking at how we can learn lessons and passing some of this information on to the aviation community to just do a better job. So you certainly are an expert in this. We very, very much appreciate your time and your expertise and taking the time to support NAFI. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, and continue to fly safe and instruct well.
Good advice.
Yeah. All right.
Just to wrap things up, remember that you can get wings credit for this program. Just click on the link on the page, and it will take you directly to the FAA website, where you can take the test, review the content, get wings credit. We'd very much like some feedback on this program by going to the course evaluation link. Feel free to add your comments. All we're trying to do is to, like all flight instructors, we just want to do things better. So it's the same with this program. And please consider a donation to the National NAFI Educational Foundation to help support development of other programs like this. If you look at the Mentor Live page, you'll get an idea about what the upcoming broadcasts are. And as I said before, you can also have a look at the archive broadcasts, which are excellent reference materials that you can use with one student or a group of students. And next month, remember, these are the third Wednesday at 8 p.m. Save that date. Ned Parks will discuss 8 magic tricks to kill flight school business. So I'm looking forward to hearing that one. Put the date on your calendar and be sure to join us again. So thank you so much for watching this program. And again, our thanks to Mike Adams for his expertise, and Paul Prydecker, wishing you well. And as Mike said, fly safe and fly smart.